Good afternoon, everyone. Let's begin. Welcome to the University of Chicago Law School, and welcome in particular to this series on policing. Several weeks ago, our country was horrified by the brutal killing of George Floyd. George Floyd's killing by the Minneapolis police comes after a sequence of other deaths of African Americans by the police. These killings have brought forward fundamental questions about the nature and structure of policing in our country. There have been many protests across the country and many calls for change in policing. What can the academy and specifically law schools contribute in a moment such as this? I think there are several things. First, the academy is a place where inquiry is conducted, where knowledge is sought and gathered, and law schools can share this knowledge. What is known about police practices? What is not known? We are fortunate at the University of Chicago Law School to have a large group of highly engaged scholars who have examined many aspects of policing using a variety of different methodologies. Many of our faculty have been directly engaged in seeking to change police behavior. We have this knowledge and expertise, and it's an honor to share it in this venue. Law schools are also a place where new ideas can be proposed, examined, and analyzed. Many of these ideas include proposals for changing current police practices. Some of these ideas are modest reforms, others are radical shifts. Law schools can be a place where these ideas are explored, vetted, their advantages and disadvantages are weighed, the probabilities of their success are considered, and their consequences are anticipated. Lawyers and law professors are especially well suited to these sorts of analyses because police have such an intimate relationship to our legal system. And we are fortunate to have faculty who have been engaged in this sort of thinking, as well as some who've been directly involved in implementing changes in police forces. Lastly, the academy can be a place where difficult conversations about the most important social issues can be conducted. Law schools and universities are a place of serious reflection and study and dialogue on important questions and policy choices. In this series, I hope that we will do all of these things. A few weeks ago, we began with a colloquium on the crisis in policing. If you did not see that event, or if you would like to see it again, it is on the law school's website. And now we are pleased to begin this series on policing. Over the course of the series, the topics will range from racial disparities, which is today's topic, to equal protection, to civilian control of police forces, to police unions, from the use of force policies to qualified immunity and more. I want to thank several people for making today's discussion and this series possible. Professors Adam Chilton and John Rappaport, whose initial conversations were the genesis of the idea for this series. I want to thank Professor and Deputy Dean Richard McAdams for developing the idea and for organizing our program and organizing the participation of our faculty. I want to thank David Gilbranson and our IT department for our help in making this remote event possible. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for joining us for this conversation. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for this discussion, Professor Emily Buss. Professor Buss is the Mark and Barbara Freed Professor of Law. She's an expert on children's and parents' rights, an author of important works on the juvenile justice system, and a much admired teacher in the law school. I'm pleased to hand it over to our moderator, Professor Emily Buss.
Thanks so much, Tom, and welcome to all of you. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to serve as a moderator for this multi-week ongoing discussion of policing. As your moderator, I have three responsibilities. It's very simple. One is to introduce the speakers, which I will do in a moment, one at a time before they speak. Second, to keep time, and I hope to be able to send silent chat messages to our speakers to let them know how their time is going, but if necessary, I'll interrupt unmuted, because a big aim of this discussion series is to give an opportunity for all of you to ask questions, to engage in a discussion. So we want to leave a lot of time for that. And third, I see my most important responsibility is asking your questions. So please send questions to me through the chat. They should come to me. You can hover over my picture and get the chat option. And I will do everything I can to get all of your questions, as many as possible, to the speakers for the discussion. So today's topic is social science perspectives on racial disparities, policing, and crime. And today's speakers are Sonja Starr and Dharmapala. We'll begin with Sonja Starr, and I'm thrilled to welcome Sonja Starr not only to this discussion today, but most importantly to the University of Chicago Law School. This is her first day joining our faculty after 11 years teaching at the University of Michigan. Professor Starr's teaching and research focus on criminal law and criminal justice. Topics of her research include the use of predictive algorithms in sentencing and bail, racial and other disparities in prosecution and sentencing, and policies designed to expand employment opportunities for people with criminal records. Most recently, she gained some fame for her tweet storm in response to Heather McDonald's op-ed challenging claims of racial disproportionality in police violence. It is on this topic and other evidence of racial disparity in policing that she speaks today. Welcome, Sonja.
Thank you so much. I am totally delighted to be joining this amazing community, and it's terrific to have so many students and alumni to talk about this important topic. So we're here in a moment of national trauma. I think it's fair to say, but on the other hand, also a moment of incredible energy around addressing inequalities and excessive violence in policing, and even in fundamentally questioning the role of police, whether we need them to serve so many functions in our communities. And so I think we should see this as an opportunity, maybe a once in a generation or possibly even once in a lifetime opportunity. I'm going to focus today on what social science can tell us about racial disparities in policing, because that's my training and it's the focus of this panel. At the end, I'm going to mention why I think these data questions, while they are important as background and they are important for some particular purposes, they actually aren't the only thing that's important and shouldn't necessarily be at the center of the current debate. So with that caveat, here's what the data make absolutely clear. Black people in America are much more likely than people of other races to be stopped by the police, arrested, subjected to the use of physical force by police, and shot and killed by them. For example, Black people are 2.5 times as likely to be arrested compared to white people, and about 3 times as likely to be killed by police. Black people are also much more likely to face criminal charges and ultimately to be incarcerated. 1 in 9 Black men between the ages of 18 and 35 is presently behind bars, 1 in 15 of all ages, and 1 in 3 Black men will pass through prison or jail at some point in his life. The Black incarceration rate is 6 times the white rate, and on all of these stats, the Hispanic rate is somewhere in between the Black and white rates. Now, all these statistics are related to each other. For example, the disparities in use of force and police shootings are driven principally, but not entirely, by the underlying disparities in stops and arrests. So more police interactions lead to more situations that can go wrong. So everybody agrees on these basic numbers. What people disagree about is why these disparities exist. The typical defense that's offered by police departments and their advocates is that all of this is explained by crime differences at the individual and neighborhood levels. The argument of the Black Lives Matter movement is that it's substantially explained by racism, either on the part of police or systemic racism in society. Now, I want to talk about the crime defense. Substantially, what I'm going to talk about today is whether it's true statistically that crime differences can explain policing differences. So one problem, a major empirical challenge in answering this question is that we don't have good measures of crime rates. This is a big problem for everyone who studies crime, right? Most crime is unreported. We don't have cameras everywhere watching our every public and private move. And so researchers have to use some kind of proxy for crime rates. Sometimes researchers, especially non-academic commentators, actually use arrest rates by race as their measure of how much crime people of different races commit. Now, that is pretty much the worst thing you can do if you're trying to estimate policing disparities, because it's hopelessly circular. Arrests are not crimes, arrests are police decisions. And if the police are racially biased, then the arrest numbers are going to build in that bias. So if you can't use arrests, what can you use? Well, there's some types of crime where we have pretty good data. I'm kind of a fan of using survey data, either victimization surveys for crimes that have victims, or self-reporting data for things like drug use. So marijuana use, for instance, people answer surveys about, that's still a crime in some places. And it turns out that marijuana use rates are basically the same across races. Distribution rates aren't very different either. But in places where marijuana is criminalized, Black people are about 4 times as likely to be arrested for possessing it. There's also some studies where researchers have tried to directly observe people's behavior. For instance, there's several famous studies where researchers either drove along the highway and measured and observed the race of people passing them, or they took radar guns and sat by the side of the highway and measured people's speed and took pictures of them. And then they compared the racial breakdown of people who were speeding to the breakdown of traffic stops on the same highway. And those studies found that Black drivers who were speeding were much more likely to get pulled over than white drivers who were speeding. That kind of study design isn't available for most kinds of crimes, but traffic stops are an important subset of police interactions. Then there are studies that look at neighborhood level racial disparities, like whether policing looks different in Black and brown and white neighborhoods. And those studies control for reported crime rates in those neighborhoods, which is still not perfect because a lot of crime is not reported, but at least it doesn't depend on police arrest decisions. An example is the analysis that the plaintiffs in the New York City showed that Black New Yorkers were far more likely to be stopped even after accounting for neighborhood crime rates. So these are just a couple examples. There are scores of studies of racial disparities in policing, 100 studies of racial disparities elsewhere in the justice process, and they take a large number of different approaches, the merits of which are debatable. But a substantial majority do find disparities that remain unexplained even after the researchers attempt to account for crime rates at the neighborhood or individual level. It is important, I think, to acknowledge that we do know there are some crime differences by race. In particular, homicide is one of the best documented crimes. It is generally reported. Black men are much, much more likely than people of other races to die by homicide. While that includes a non-trivial share that are deaths at the hands of police, most are not, and most are committed by other Black men. And so those defending police conduct often like to compare the rates of police violence to the general rates of homicide. And they also often use robbery rates as a point of comparison. So you hear people say, yes, Black people were 3 times as likely to be killed by police, but they were 4 times as likely to be arrested robbery or homicide or something like that. Those aren't exact numbers. Why is it always robbery homicide in these comparisons? It's not a coincidence, I think. It's because people are making those comparisons to defend police conduct. And of all crimes, those are the 2 where the arrest figures are the most disproportionately Black. It's the statistic, it's the benchmark against which the distribution of police killings looks least racially tilted. The problem, I think, with this argument is that this defense only makes sense if the police only shoot people or use force when they're interrupting a murder or a robbery in progress, right, or responding to a murder or robbery scene. That, however, is totally untrue. Police violence frequently emerges from much more routine interactions, including those affecting completely innocent people. For instance, New York's stop and frisk program, the vast majority of those stopped were not carrying any contraband and were doing nothing wrong. Or maybe it's people not behaving entirely lawfully, but doing things that many of us do often, like speeding or jaywalking, having an expired license plate. Those are the types of things that, that many people of all races do on a regular basis, but much more frequently seem to result in police interactions for Black and brown people, especially in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And the result of this is that innocent Black people bear an enormous policing burden that innocent people of other races do not. And I think that is very difficult to justify on the basis of crime rates, right? So there's another variant of the Black crime argument that you hear sometimes. So sometimes people say, look, police just go to the neighborhoods where serious crime takes place. And one byproduct of that is that people there get stopped more frequently. But those neighborhoods need police because crime is a huge threat to law-abiding people there, and it's a much bigger threat than police violence. So Professor Dharmapala will address the question of whether policing deters crime. I want to say a few things about this, though, as a defense policing disparities, right? So first, as I mentioned, empirical studies tend to show that disparities persist even after you control for neighborhood crime rates. So crime rates may be part of the explanation for those disparities, but not all of it. But second, I think more importantly, an awful lot of members of those very neighborhoods that are supposedly benefiting from intensive policing have for years, and especially recently, been pouring into the streets, risking their lives in the middle of a pandemic that is hitting their communities hard, to cry out for a change in policing practices. You know, there's a lot of support, surveys show, for very fundamental changes. And when you hear these kinds of widely held, heartfelt demands for change, I find it a little tone deaf response, like, hey, don't you see that crime is your problem and that the police are actually helping you, right? Everyone knows that crime is a problem, but that doesn't mean that police behavior isn't also a problem, and that it wouldn't be possible to re-envision the relationship between communities and a police that might actually help to address serious crime more effectively. And I also think it's not surprising there would be more crime of certain sorts in Black communities, because crime of many sorts is closely empirically correlated to poverty. And many Black neighborhoods, not all of course, but many suffer from a level of concentrated poverty that is much more extreme than we see in other communities. And that poverty is in turn the effect of hundreds of years of racism and racist institutions. This, I think, twice, cracking down with more police, right? That not only has immediate consequences for communities, but also potentially long-term consequences, which might even increase crime in the long term. So you can think about like what happens to kids' futures when their parents are behind bars. So you know, we could instead look for broader societal solutions, to economic interventions, maybe reparations for slavery, and not just talk about Black crime as a justification for more police. So final thing I want to say is that in the end, I think the question of whether particular police shootings or arrests or the general pattern of these are driven by racial discrimination, especially intentional racial discrimination, isn't for most purposes the one that we need to be asking, right? It's important, for instance, if you're a litigant trying to prove a discrimination claim. But at this moment, I think in America, we have the opportunity to get beyond that narrow focus and to focus on systemic or structural racism. The idea of systemic racism, I think probably other meetings of this series will touch on more, but it doesn't mean that everyone in the system is a racist, or even that most people are. What it means is that racial inequality is so locked into the system, into so many dimensions of American life and American criminal justice, that even when it operates in a formally race-neutral way in practice, our justice system heaps hugely disproportionate burdens on Black communities. And the existence of those disproportionate burdens is not contested, and it's a problem, I think, that society has to address. That's it for now.
Thank you, Sonja. One thing I appreciate, I don't know if you saw the timekeeping as it went on. You did pretty well. Congratulations. I have not received any questions yet, and that might just mean that you don't have them yet, but I wonder whether there's any kind of a glitch in the system. You can ask questions while you're listening. I won't interrupt her or Dhammika, I promise. I encourage people who have questions, at least a few, to send them so we can verify that that system is working. Again, sending chat questions to me. Our next speaker is Dhammika Dharmapala, who has joined the law school faculty here in 2014, having previously taught at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He serves as co-editor of the Journal of Law and Economics and is an international research fellow of the Oxford University Center for Business Taxation, among many other roles. He serves on the advisory board of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center and has previously served on the board of the American Law and Economics Association, among others. His scholarship spans the fields of taxation, economic analysis of law, corporate finance and governance. And in recent years, he has joined other faculty here on research on policing. Today, he will discuss the empirical social science literature, including the law and economics literature, addressing the effect of policing on crime. Welcome, Dhammika. Dhammika, you're there.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me? I think I had trouble unmuting there. Thank you very much to everyone for being here. I will briefly introduce some social science perspectives on the impact of policing on crime, focusing, as Professor Bass said, on the law and economics literature in particular. As many of you will know, the deterrence hypothesis is central to the economic theory of crime and implies that policing should have a large impact on crime rates, particularly by increasing the probability of detection. However, empirical scholars traditionally found it difficult to estimate a substantial impact of policing on crime. One explanation that's often given for this is that the number of police and the intensity of policing themselves respond to changes in crime rates, making it difficult to observe the causal impact, if you like, of police on crime. Thus, more recent work has sought to find episodes in which policing activity changes for reasons that are completely unrelated to crime. So just one example is that Steve Levitt of our economics department noticed that police recruitment tends to be higher in years in which a mayor faces an election, and used this variation to study the impact of police on crime. And my starting point for this discussion is a survey that was published a few years ago by Chalkin and McCrary that reviews this work, particularly in economics and law and economics. They conclude that the findings are quite mixed. Across a wide variety of approaches, there's some work that finds substantial effects, other work finding small effects, and others just finding very imprecise estimates, which means that we cannot conclude anything in particular. However, I think since that survey was published, there has emerged a literature that I think is particularly relevant to the discussions that we're having today. This is a literature on police slowdowns and stoppages, typically due to labor disputes. And these may be the most relevant for the current discussion because not only do these phenomena represent reductions in policing activity, but more especially, the authors of these studies argue that during these events, these slowdowns and stoppages, the reduction in activity is concentrated on lower level enforcement. And it is lower level enforcement of that may be the most problematic for the police-civilian encounters that are currently of great concern. Together with that, there's a shift in relative intensity towards serious crime. So some examples of this include work by Andrea Chandrasekhar that uses a work slowdown in New York City in 1997 due to a union contract dispute. She finds a large decline in police activity, but very little impact on serious crimes. The political scientists Sullivan and O'Keefe study a work slowdown in New York City, also in New York City, that took place in late 2014 and early 2015. And this dispute was due to a dispute with the mayor about the response to the death of Eric Garner. And what they find is that civilian complaints of major crimes actually fell during the slowdown. And certainly they can rule out increases with a high level of certainty. What this emerging research does, I think, is to raise the possibility that it may be possible to produce the same amount of public safety with less police activity. That is certainly, I think, relevant for the current discussions that we're having. So to be clear, I want to emphasize that the social science literature on policing and crime has significant ambiguities and some contradictory findings. However, I think this literature that I've described on slowdowns and stoppages is particularly relevant for the reasons I've stated. And it would be reasonable to conclude, right, despite the existence of contrary findings, that the movement to reduce police funding and police intensity has a fairly firm grounding in a substantial body of supported social scientific evidence. But I would like to make a few points at the end that are more in the way of caveats. All of this evidence, including the slowdown studies, are about relatively modest changes in policing intensity. The evidence does not speak to the consequences of larger changes or what we might think of as outright police abolition, because that is far outside the range of what is observed. Secondly, there are so the studies of the impact of policing on crime tell us, or the impact of policing on public safety tell us about the benefits of policing. And ultimately, we need to balance that against the costs, which include harm to innocent civilians, and these costs are also quite disparate by race in the way that Professor Starr has described. And so there's a need to take that into account. So what I'm describing is, if you like, one half of the equation, rather than a full accounting of costs and benefits. So I think I'm very happy to answer questions in more detail, but the overall the overall message, I think, from this literature is that while it's very very contradictory in its findings, right? We see we don't see the kind of consistent finding of a large impact of policing on crime that might be expected from basic theory of deterrence. The results are very mixed. The most relevant evidence, I think, comes from these studies of police slowdowns and stoppages, and they raise the possibility that we may be able to produce, we may be able to have similar amounts of public safety with respect to serious crimes without as much policing intensity or with smaller numbers of police. So I think I have a couple of minutes remaining, but I think I'll cede that, given the importance, given that we've reached the 12:30 point. I think I want to stop here rather than go into a little more.
Okay, great, thank you. We do have lots of questions that have come in. Thank you for everybody who began to send questions. I wanted to give you each an opportunity, if you want to, beginning with Sonja, to ask a question of your fellow speaker, if there's something that you think would be good to bring out through a question.
Sure. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what was happening during the police slowdowns that were in these studies, because I could imagine pushback that says, well, look, maybe police weren't writing as many tickets because part of their labor strategy was to starve the city of revenue, right? But they were still out there, right? The police still existed. They might even have been visible on the streets to people, having the same deterrent effect. So is it the case that like the public was conscious of there being less police during that time, or was the nature of the change such that one would have expected it to reduce deterrence of major crimes, or was it more subtle, like the police are still at the side of the road but they're just not stopping people?
Gotta unmute yourself.
You're still muted, Dhammika.
You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. It's telling me that the host has muted me. Thank you. So that's a very very important question. I think the point is actually not so much that we would expect reduced deterrence of major crimes. It is that it is possible to reallocate resources in a way that doesn't that significantly reduces policing intensity, but doesn't lead to an increase in major crimes. So these studies emphasize that there was a deliberate strategy of the police union to not and it was partly to maintain public support for the police, to not allow major crimes to increase or reduce enforcement with regard to major crimes. So the point is not that we would expect reduced deterrence of those crimes. It is that it is possible to reduce policing intensity and reallocate effort in a way that doesn't increase them. If you see the distinction, right? So we're not. So the tests are not actually saying that, or these studies are not saying that we would expect major crimes to fall. I'm sorry, major crimes to increase necessarily because there's an across the board, as we would if there was an across the board reduction in police effort, but rather that the inputs into policing can be rearranged. And I think that speaks to the issue of whether about how much resources are needed, how much policing is needed to produce a given amount of public safety, rather than to the deterrence hypothesis. Because exactly as you said, police were still on the streets and they were enforcing these against these major crimes. So I'm not sure if that's completely responsive to your question.
I'm going to jump in as the somewhat ruthless moderator and say, too bad. If it's not totally responsive, she'll have to wait, because we do have lots of questions, and I'm going to be so arbitrary as to say, sorry, Dhammika, but I'm not going to give you the reciprocal opportunity, because now I do want to make sure that we hear from others. You'll find that I'm willing to do this to try to make sure that we have a good discussion. We had a number of questions that are some version of responding, Sonja, to your point that we should take seriously that people are out on the streets protesting. This is telling us that these very communities that are being over-policed want something different. And a number of questions push back on that and say, well, how do we know what the percentages are? The people who are not protesting or don't share the view. How do we have information from those very communities that tells us how many people might have a different view? And I'll just sort of throw in that after the very serious sort of spate of violence in Chicago over the last couple of weekends, one mother who lost her child to sort of a random gunshot said, we need more police. So how do we know what's on the other side?
So it's clearly the case that that viewpoints within affected communities are not uniform, right? I don't have the survey data memorized. I'm tempted, like while Dhammika is answering his next question, to use the cheat available on Zoom webinars and Google it. But I have seen, though, that there is quite widespread, surprisingly widespread support among all Americans, including white Americans, and even across political parties, but particularly high support in African American communities for at least substantial policing reform, and I think for the goal of defunding the police, but I'm going to look up to see whether that is true. I think it is a fair question, right? That you know, we never know quite how representative protesters are, but I'm pretty sure that the survey data backs it up. And you know, I think that's why we're seeing in you know, cities like Minneapolis, what historically would be considered a very surprising response from the city council to actually vote to abolish the police department. I want to caveat that by saying the abolition proposal that the Minneapolis City Council voted for contemplates the creation of a new law enforcement unit within the new Department of Public Safety, but it would be differently structured and so forth. In any case, I think we're seeing political representatives respond to demand in their communities. But I'm going to cheat and use Google when Dhammika takes this.
Okay, why don't I ask a question that's focused more on Dhammika's presentation, so you have a quick chance to do that, but we may or may not be able to circle back to that. Dhammika, there's some questions about, sort of on the one hand, what you learned from some slight reduction in policing, and what you captured this in your presentation, that's not giving us information about what a dramatic change in policing might do. And so one question is there a way, have there been studies, or could there be a study that looked at a kind of gradual decrease and sort of learning from a kind of gradual change? Would that be a promising way to try to go about recalibrating the level of police that is most effective, recognizing all the social costs that come along with too much policing?
So I understand that to mean, you know, can you incrementally change policing intensity and then learn from that, and then maybe proceed or not as based on the evidence that comes out of that. And I think that does make sense. There is, as I said, a substantial body of social scientific evidence that would support kind of starting out that process. What we don't know is what larger changes, what impact larger changes would have. There simply haven't been many instances of police, you know, abolition, and we have no idea what would happen. The only evidence I could find on that was actually a very rather extreme case. There is a paper from the 1970s about the situation in Denmark during World War II, when occupation authorities disbanded the police entirely, and that finds a large increase in crime. But there's much else going on with the military occupation and so forth. So we don't have good evidence on that. But I think changing incrementally, learning from those changes, creating variation that empirical scholars can use, and using the evidence they produce as inputs into further policymaking, makes a lot of sense.
Sonja, back to you, and maybe you can figure out a way to wedge into whatever you found. But a number of questions ask whether we can break out wealth disparities and sort of separate the information on racial disparities and separately assess the role played by poverty and wealth disparities.
So, you know, it's hard to fully separate those factors in any study of racial disparities, because race and poverty are so intertwined in this country that there's that again, it's hard to find, like within a particular city, often really comparable neighborhoods of different races that have the same level of concentrated poverty, and in some ways, I guess, given that poverty in Black communities is so tied up with the history of structural racism, I guess I question why it matters so much to differentiate it from wealth as a cause. That said, neighborhood level, it's really hard to do this in individual level studies because you don't have measures of people's wealth in individual level data, but in neighborhood level studies, racial disparities do tend to persist when they include controlled variables for things like the poverty rate or the median household income. I did look up some stats. It turns out that it really matters how you ask the question, it looks like a clear majority of Black respondents, and actually a majority of all respondents, favor the goal of reallocating some police funding to other social services. And if you frame it that way, instead of just the phrase defund the police, gets more polarizing reactions because people don't really know what it means. But there's also quite kind of shocking data about the percentages of Black men, for instance, who say that having police around make them feel safer versus less safe. It's like 3 or 4 times as many say it makes them feel less safe rather than safer to have police around. So this is not just a small, it's not just a few people that are saying this. It's a broad collectively recognized problem, I think.
So this question, I think, could go to both of you. I'm aware of some of the research that Dhammika has done that may bear on this, but I'd like to hear from both of you. A number of the questions I'm going to sort of distill and suggest there's a sort of exploring to what extent is this about police or no police versus, different roles that the police might hold. And I guess related to that is a question of how realistic is it to, within police change roles versus change funding and radically change the kind of people identified as responding. Anything that either of you would like to say on this topic? Seems to me there are many questions that one way or another address that. Dhammika, why don't you go first?
Certainly. So as I understand it, the question is really about not so much the quantity of policing, but the type of policing.
Well, to what extent there are things that are, I know you've done some studies of sort of who wants to be a police officer, right? So the sort of the question of to what extent, to the extent there might be some consensus about kinds of changes that should occur. A big decision is to what extent one tries to do that internally, or to what extent one diverts resources and is less.
Indeed, and I think one of the people sort of, I think, exaggerate what some of the proposals that are out there. One for one thing, as Professor Starr mentioned with respect to Minneapolis, the proposals out there are not so much to abolish or dismantle police departments as to reconstitute them, that I think so. If we bear that in mind, there is a sort of a selection effect as to who chooses to join a law enforcement agency. That may be part of it. Training, maybe changing training practices may be important, but some of my work is also focused on police unions and the impact of police unions and procedural protections in misconduct, and I think all of those are part of the conversation about reform. But I think unfortunately a lot of the empirical studies cannot really speak to some of these reforms because they haven't been tried extensively enough, or not been tried in a setting where there are sort of clear comparison groups, right? Effective in comparison groups. But there are often sort of conceptual reasons to think that certain reforms will work, and that might provide some basis, even if there's no empirical evidence yet.
So, I mean, I think that, so in most countries in the world, governments don't spend nearly the same fraction of money on police. And in fact, there's a lot of variation among US jurisdictions as to how much of the budget police consume, and thus how much, in terms of responding to things like mental health emergencies, homelessness, et cetera, how much of that falls in the plate of the police versus other services. And so, you know, given that variation, I don't think it's unrealistic for, at least for jurisdictions that are on the high end of police expenditures and of centralizing responsiveness to civil society needs in the police to think about doing it another way. It's not like it's, you know, it's not unimaginable. Like, societies throughout the world have in fact imagined and done it. Now, that said, I wish there were some good empirical studies that rigorously assessed the effects of changes within particular cities, or even cross-sectional comparisons. And I don't across different jurisdictions. It's hard to make those types of studies causally rigorous, and so I haven't seen any.
Thanks. I want to say there are a lot of excellent questions, some of which I think are more kind of within the frame of the topic today, but I don't want to, I'm sort of looking at to try to balance some of that. This may be an example of a question that falls outside what you two each feel you can comment on, but maybe not. So I want to give it a try, which is how do guns fit in all this? Second Amendment rights, lots of guns, availability of guns. How much is this a piece of either story that you're studying?
I think the prevalence of guns in our society is a reason that we have the police carry guns, and that is one reason our rate of police shootings is far higher than any other countries, right? Like, there's many countries in Europe where police do not routinely carry lethal weapons, and I think police in our country would argue that they would be defenseless in a situation where the citizenry can be armed if they were not armed. And that is a big problem. And I don't know how to unwind it with our current Second Amendment doctrine. I will say that I want to point to a certain hypocrisy in certain quarters about the Second Amendment, right? Like, people who want to minimize the problem of police violence often point to the fact that most people who are shot by police are classified as armed, right? Like, if you look at the databases of police violence, it's only a relatively small fraction that are unarmed. And there's this move that gets made, this rhetorical move to say, well, it's only the killing of unarmed people that we need to be focused on. But that, to me, is just a shocking move coming from people who, for the most part, believe that gun ownership and ownership of other weapons is and possession of them is, in fact, a constitutional right? Like, and the fact that somebody is classified in a database as having had a weapon somewhere in their car or on their person does not mean that they were threatening the police officer with the weapon, and it certainly doesn't mean that the requirements for self-defense were satisfied. And so I think we need to look just as carefully at all those killings of armed civilians, and not just assume the presence of a weapon gives the police the right to shoot you. That seems like the opposite of what the Second Amendment right stands for.
I would just add very briefly that the fact that there's a larger quantity of guns in the United States may lead to more police shootings, but it doesn't automatically lead to racially disparate police shootings, and so there must be something else going on there too.
That's true, but just the scale of the problem is greater. And I want to say, like, there's problems. We've been focused on race today, and it's hard not to because the problem is so racialized. But the dysfunctions in our police go beyond racial disparity, right? And nobody's arguing that the solution is that the police should arrest and shoot more white people, right? Like the goal is to reduce dysfunctions in policing overall, which and those dysfunctions are currently disparately burdening Black and brown communities.
I should say, for some reason I'm having a little freezing up problem. So if I totally look like I'm checked out at some point, one of the other people who has control of a mic might step in, but it seems okay now. I connected with some of the things you said, Sonja. There's some of the questions that wanted to focus on how much we know about the circumstances leading to the altercation that led to the killing. So, after the fact, there's information about whether someone was armed or not. After the fact, there's some information about the specific details of what occurred. But in George Floyd's case, what started it all was an alleged passing of a counterfeit bill. And Mr. Brooks, it was this, being inebriated and falling asleep at a Wendy's. So do we have data that allows us to draw that connection? And then engage in an assessment of racial disparity, sort of what started whatever led to the decision that to shoot?
Yeah, so I tried to search in the Washington Post's database to see whether they had it characterized by like type of underlying suspected criminal behavior. And I think maybe if you dug in the data, you could, like if you clicked on the individual cases, you might be able to find it, but I may have missed something, but I didn't see a way that they categorized that. I think it's at least anecdotally or sort of conventional wisdom that like a lot of these cases, and a lot of the cases certainly that have captured headlines, do arise from pretty routine circumstances, which isn't necessarily to say absolutely no criminal wrongdoing, but just relatively routine criminal wrongdoing. I will say that to analyze racial disparities that way is difficult because in these databases, like the Post databases, you only have the cases that in fact resulted in a police shooting, right? And in fact, I think that one is only fatal police shootings. And even at best, you have you might be able to find some data sets that have all stops or all arrests or something in them. But what you don't have is the broader denominator of all the cases that didn't result in arrests and stops. And in many of the data sets, you don't even have any of the cases that didn't result in shootings. And so without that underlying pool, you can't really analyze like conditional on underlying behavior or the underlying criminal conduct or lack thereof or something. What is the probability of leading to a certain kind of police outcome? There's really just no way to analyze that when you only observe the ones that result in a particular police outcome.
So another question, looking very broadly, stepping back and looking at general crime rates and significant reduction in crime rates. Is there a happy story in there? Is there a story that we can tie in with all of the things that have been identified as problems? What do we make of this? Does it bespeak some kind of success?
Well, if I could jump in, so there has been this trend over the last few decades for crime rates to fall. There's still, I think social scientists are still debating exactly why that has happened, but obviously it's a happy story. There is this joke among people who study crime that there's very little that's actually, there's not that much that's actually known, despite the vast amount of research. There's a joke that the best way to reduce crime rates is to speed up the aging process. Because changes in demographics is one explanation for this. But what is interesting is, bringing that to our current topic, what's interesting is that an apparent increase in police violence, at least certainly an increase in reports of police violence, has taken place against the background of a decreasing trend in crime rates, and that seems unexpected, perhaps, under the view that police violence is just a function of the amount of crime.
Yeah, that basically covered it. There's a lot of debate about what the causes are, and I should say that one potential cause is reduction in poverty and increasing and substantial increases in high school graduation rates, which is one of the greatest predictors of crime. So it could be police, or it could be defenders of mass incarceration. Say maybe it's because we're locking more people up, right? But there's also socioeconomic things that have happened that are also overall over our history a positive story, and how much to attribute is very difficult, because when changes occur over a long period of time, so many things in society change at the same time that causally attributing it to any particular thing it's a really difficult empirical problem.
So just a challenge whenever we try to convert all that you do into policy. On this, thinking about how we can learn the most, some questions about, to what extent do we need to focus only on what we can learn from the American experience, and to what extent can we learn valuable lessons from looking at, you mentioned briefly some patterns of behavior elsewhere, Sonja, but to what extent is that valuable? How exceptional are we along so many dimensions, and how does that affect how valuable looking abroad can be in this area, in both of your areas?
I think the biggest way that we're exceptional is more guns. Many societies throughout the world have many of the same general social challenges that we do. They have pockets of extreme poverty. They have diverse populations with that are stratified in various different ways. And they don't have the same issues with police violence. I think that the only underlying thing besides police behavior and the criminal justice system itself that I think is different in our society is the prevalence of gun violence, and that it is a confounding factor.
That is very true. But I think also one of the lessons from these recent protests was their global nature. So people were marching in London and around the world. So some of these problems are actually not, by and large, not necessarily exceptional to the US, but are more widespread in nature. But I think, having said that, there is also the opportunity to learn from comparing experiences of different countries. And I think that's something that future research should focus on.
I'm very mindful of being a timekeeper. We're at 12:59. What I want to say, I know some of you didn't get your questions answered. I did try to combine and look for themes. We are able to record the chat, we are told, I hope. So I will be on the lookout for questions that may fit well with other discussions that may not have gotten answered, and try to make sure not to lose those. But of course, you can join again and ask the question again. Thank you all for participating, and look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. Thank you very much, presenters as well, Sonja and Dhammika.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.